Last but definitely not least, Stephen.
So thank you very much, Peter, and thanks to the organizers to have this opportunity to talk about something called low-level presence. And I think there have been some references to low-level presence in the last 2 or 3 days. So I've got quite a few slides here, but I'm just going to quickly get into the meat of the subject. Where are we? Yes, the big green button. Thank you very much. I work for the trade association CropLife Canada, based in Ottawa. So we represent 30-plus companies. These companies are in the plant science areas, including biotechnology, as in biotech seeds, GMOs, as well as pesticides. So there's some company names there you're probably very familiar with. So as a trade association, we've set ourselves some goals about raising awareness about the benefits of plant science technologies. We try to advocate for legislation, regulation, and so on that is suitable based on safety and all this sort of business. So we have quite a few conversations with Phil and his colleagues, for example, at the Food Inspection Agency. We try to do advocate for life cycle stewardship. Now, this is more on the pesticide side, but we're very much behind the scenes in terms of insect resistance management around BT corn and those sorts of things. And importantly, and particularly for the subject I'm going to be talking about, is that we do forge and lead alliances with other stakeholders who have an interest around policy, if I can use that word there to get you excited there, Peter. So bottom line is, I think our job as a trade association, as lobbyists or advocates, is to facilitate creating choice for farmers and producers. And over the last couple of days, we've heard some fantastic presentations about the science, about the technology and the future of plant sciences. And it really is very exciting. And so this slide here, you've all seen this before, but I think this just provides a bit of context that in terms of plant biotechnology, GMOs, recombinant DNA derived plants, it's been an amazing success. And you can see here the increasing number of countries who are adopting these products, the number of products that are being produced in various different crops and the various different traits that have been introduced. So it's been a fantastic success. We often hear quotes in the media and scientific literature and so on that of all the agricultural technologies in the lifetime of humans, this one is probably the fastest that's been adopted. Maybe tractors and things like that might be another one, but it's been amazing. However, it gets complicated when we start putting all of this into the context of trade. And most countries are in the business of trade, as in either importing products or exporting them. So the problem is about synchrony of approvals. And so Phil was talking about the world-class Canadian regulatory system. You were, yes. And other countries also have comparable regulatory systems, and other countries are trying to catch up, but they're not always at the same time, at the same place in terms of the regulatory requirements and so on. And then complicating that is the developers of these plant science innovations, the large multinational companies, universities, some of the smaller enterprises. They're not always putting their submissions for regulatory approval all at the same time in the various markets where they probably should do it. Now, the counter-argument to that is, yes, that's all very nice. So, Monsanto, for example, could, spend a fortune putting submissions into, say, 15 countries that are key, that would be implicated in trade. But the problem is those 15 countries aren't always at the same space. So, bottom line is, we get this thing called commingling, particularly in the field crops that are harvested for trade in grain, where shipments actually contain a mixture of different biotech events amongst perhaps even conventional varieties, grains from those conventional varieties. And so this commingling causes what we call low-level presence. And I'll elaborate a little bit about that in a minute. But the context is the field crops. This probably doesn't, well, it may apply in the future, I don't know, around some of the vegetable crops, apples and potatoes. I'm really talking here about corn, soybeans, canola, and so on. that are moved around the world in trade in very large volumes through very actually quite sophisticated bulk handling systems. But these systems aren't designed for segregated products. So a lot of countries, including Canada, actually all countries that I know of that have regulations in this area, have a zero tolerance policy for events, as we call it, biotech products that have not yet received regulatory approval. So Canada is one of those countries too. So we often talk about how wonderful Canada is in its trade and pushing policies and all this kind of stuff. But internally, when it comes to imports into Canada, we're in the same boat. So this makes it very difficult for the grain handlers and for farmers, quite frankly, who are producing these crops and putting them into the system. So just to elaborate a little bit, just a bit of a schematic here, because it's not always obvious to all people listening to presentations like I'm giving in terms of your context. Not everybody has I don't have any experience of farming, but not everybody has the experience of how these grains are actually produced. So just quickly go through the obvious. A farmer will seed a field of their crop. Let's just say it's canola for the sake of argument. Hopefully the season has been good for that farmer and they get a good crop. So they will go into the business of harvesting that crop. Then they'll store it somewhere, ready for it to be shipped. And in countries like Canada, US, Brazil, Australia, and probably Ukraine and other grain-producing countries, there are these primary elevators where all these sort of stored materials are pooled. So now we're collecting, dozens and dozens of farmers' fields and different farmers pooling their products into an elevator, definitely meeting certain standards in terms of the class of the product. Now, if you're thinking about wheat, there are dozens of different types of classes of wheat. Canola, in the example I'm giving you, is a little bit simpler. Anyway, then that elevator then has to move the product to the market. So in Canada and many other countries, a lot of that's done by road or by rail. So there's this mass movement of the grain going across the country. And I've had an opportunity to go to some of the grain elevators in Canada. There's a massive one in Vancouver, for example. But there are, if you have an opportunity here in Saskatoon, if you have a few days spare after this meeting, and you have an opportunity to visit some of the elevators, they are fantastic things. They're just huge, and they're equipped to move very large volumes of grain. Now, in terms of exports, some of this grain is moved into barges or to smaller boats, and then they end up in the main terminal where they're shipped off into very large ocean vessels. So if you think about that ocean vessel leaving Canada and heading to a market such as China or Japan, inside that vessel, let's just say it's canola, there's probably hundreds and hundreds of sources of that canola in terms of the fields where that material came from and the farmers who are producing it. And not all farmers are going to be growing the same variety of canola, even though the end product as oilseed is very similar. They're going to be, some of them are going to be herbicide tolerant. For other crops, they may have disease-resistant traits in those crops. So there'll be a whole mixture of biotech events, as we call it, potentially in that shipment. And so the expectation is that the receiving country, the regulatory system in China or Japan or wherever it is, has done the regulatory oversight and has approved all of those events that could possibly be in that shipment. So that's a very tall order, and very quickly that starts to unravel because of this asynchronicity that I was just talking about. So generally speaking, there's, for many years now, maybe 10, 12 years, there's been a very vigorous conversation amongst the grain handlers, technology developers, which CropLife Canada represents in Canada and around the world, that there is a very high priority need as a consensus for a low-level presence policy about how can we deal with this asynchronicity to enable trade to take place. Because if a boat lands in, say, Japan, and the grain handlers at that side do some testing and they find very small, doesn't have to be very many, maybe just one seed, just depends on the tolerance level, of material that's not approved, that whole shipment is then vulnerable. And there have been many occasions where that shipment had to turn around and find another market. And so there's tens of thousands of dollars at stake here. So just moving along quickly, there's consensus that we need to do something about it. The government of Canada, I'm very proud to say, has led an exercise called the Global Low-Level Presence Initiative. There are 15 countries that are participating in this over the last 4 years, where they're having discussions and meetings to try and figure out what can we do about developing a low-level presence policy. So I'm going to give you an example of the Canadian government's version. I'm just going to move ahead quickly. They have actually come up with if I can find it, here it is, a proposed model policy for a low-level presence policy. So this is the Canadian government's thinking with a lot of input from the grains industry and the plant science industry. So they're looking at sort of two levels, because there are situations where there could be material in a shipment that's come from a farmer's field that contains a biotech product that hasn't been approved outright, which is going to be problematic. But also you get these situations where there are pieces of grain, there's dust and all this sort of business, and with the very sophisticated detection techniques, and they're getting more sophisticated all the time, it's practically impossible not to find something in a shipment that perhaps has not been approved. So the government of Canada has come up with what they call a 0.2% level to sort of handle the trace amounts. So if a shipment is found to contain up to 0.2 of unapproved events in that context, then no action is applied to it. However, there's a higher level where whole grain may have been found, and so there's an extra level of a threshold. The industry that I represent and my colleagues in the grain industry are pushing for a 5% level. So in other words, that boat would contain up to 5% of material. And then the level of regulatory action will be commensurate with the risk. Now, what I haven't told you is that the other piece of context, because I skipped through the slides very quickly because Peter was flapping at me, is there's consensus in this discussion that what we're talking about here is biotech events, the biotech traits. They have to have been approved by at least one other country that has followed the Codex guidelines for food safety. So in this context, so if Japan was to discover unapproved material, and if they were to agree to this conversation around low-level presence policy, they should be reassured that Canada or the US or Brazil has already approved that product as being safe. So we're trying to sort of push a sort of a mutual acceptance type of idea across, and that's the only way that I think this is going to work. So moving along, so we're really hoping that the government of Canada, almost this time last year, it was actually at the Rapeseed Congress, the Minister of Agriculture at the time was one of the guest speakers, and we're all on the edge of our seats because he was about to announce the Canadian model policy, but for various reasons, that did not happen. We have a change of government. For those of you who are not from Canada here, we have a different government now who are now sort of rethinking this, but we're getting very positive signals that it's business as usual around this sort of policy development. So we're very much anxious for this policy to be announced. This is not going to help Canada. We're not an importer of this material, but having a policy around, as I had described, would allow the Canadian government and other stakeholders to continue the conversation with actually something solid on the table. So given the time, I'm going to stop here. Thank you very much. Cheers.
Thank you.